Western Pennsylvania, 1852. While her neighbors burned their fireplace ashes into the creek and tossed animal bones into the woods for the foxes to drag away, a Scottish widow named Isobel Crawford was carrying buckets. Every morning, every evening, every blessed day of the year, she walked the footpaths between cabins, with a yoke across her shoulders and 2 oak pails swinging at her sides, asking for the very things her neighbors were throwing away: cold ash from the hearth, bones from the stew pot, tallow scrapings from the butter churn, wool too short to spin, leather too cracked to patch. She carried it all back to a low stone outbuilding behind her cabin, and she stored it there in barrels and crocks and tightly lidded boxes, each one labeled in her neat Highland script. The men of Rowan Creek settlement called it her rubbish shed. The women called it worse. Children dared each other to peek through the cracks between the boards, expecting to find witches' charms or something unspeakable. For 6 years she listened to the whispers and the laughter at the Sunday gatherings, and she kept on collecting. Then the winter of 1852 arrived, and with it came the kind of catastrophe that reveals a settlement's hidden weaknesses all at once. A late October flood washed out the wagon road through the gap. The mill race collapsed on the Allegheny Ferry. The supply merchant in Freeport lost its warehouse to a warehouse fire that took the season's imported goods with it. By the first week of December, Rowan Creek was cut off from the outside world with no prospect of fresh supply until spring thaw broke the rivers open again in April, maybe May. No soap for washing wounds. No waterproofing for boots that had begun to rot in the snowmelt. No fertilizer for the spring planting that felt impossibly far away. No leather for the harness straps that broke under winter strain. No tools fit to the work because every replacement part had burned in that warehouse fire. And then Isobel Crawford opened the door of her rubbish shed, and the settlement discovered that the widow they had mocked for 6 long years had quietly built the most valuable building within 30 miles. If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We have more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time, because we love reading where these stories reach. Isobel Crawford came to the Pennsylvania frontier in the spring of 1846 with 2 trunks, a stone mortar that had belonged to her grandmother, and the quiet, deep-set eyes of someone who had already buried too much. Her husband Andrew had died of pleurisy during the crossing from Glasgow, 2 days out from the Irish coast, and she had made the remainder of the voyage alone in a berth she could no longer afford to keep warm. The ship's cook, a man who had known Andrew from the shipyards, gave her a small sack of black tea and told her that the Scots who had gone before her to western Pennsylvania had done well enough if they were willing to work for it. She had thanked him in the soft, careful English that she had been practicing since childhood, and she had stepped off the dock at Philadelphia with her trunks and her mortar and the $42 that remained of the money Andrew had saved. She was 34 years old that spring. She had no children, which the women at the immigrant boarding house whispered about as though it were a judgment from heaven. She had skills, though, and the skills were the true inheritance she carried across the ocean. Her father had been a candle maker in Inverness, who had taught her how to render tallow without scorching it, how to judge lye strength by the way an egg rode in the solution, how to mix dyes from lichens and iron pots. Her mother had been the village wise woman who bound up cuts and pulled babies into the world, and Isobel had carried her mother's knowledge of willow bark and yarrow, and the deep, thick ointment made from rendered bone marrow that could save a man's hand from losing its use after a bad gash. She had lived through the Highland hunger years of the early 1840s, and she had learned the first great truth of a starving people. There is no such thing as waste, only materials that have not yet been recognized. She bought her piece of land at Rowan Creek from a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer who was moving west to Ohio because his sons had gone ahead, and she paid him in silver coin that she had sewn into the hem of her traveling dress. The tract came with a half-finished cabin, a good spring, a south-facing slope that would grow oats, and 20 acres of mixed hardwood that would supply her firewood for the rest of her natural life. The farmer had thrown in the low stone outbuilding behind the cabin because, he said, he had no use for it and no way to carry it. It measured 12 feet by 18, with thick fieldstone walls that rose to 7 feet, a slate roof that the farmer had laid himself, and a heavy oak door with iron hinges forged in Lancaster County. Isobel paced it off the first afternoon she owned the land, and she understood immediately that this building, dry and cool and defensible against rats, was worth more than the cabin itself. The settlement at Rowan Creek consisted of 11 families when she arrived, with 2 more coming in by the end of that first summer. The men were Scots-Irish mostly, with a scattering of German and English, and they raised cattle and grew wheat and cut timber for the mill at Freeport. The women kept gardens and tended poultry and made butter, that they traded at the crossroads store for sugar and coffee and calico cloth. They were decent, hard-working people, and they welcomed Isobel at their Sunday gatherings, the way a frontier community always welcomes a widow, with careful kindness and careful distance both. They brought her a hen and a half-dozen eggs and a crock of preserved apples in her first week, and they watched her with interest to see how she would manage alone. What they saw confused them from the start. Isobel did not burn her ashes. She carried them in a covered crock to the stone outbuilding and stored them there in wooden barrels lined with pitched canvas. When her neighbors killed a pig in the autumn of her first year, she asked whether she might have the bones after they had finished with them. And the Huxley family, thinking she meant to make broth, gave her every bone from the animal. She carried those bones home too, and she boiled them clean in a large iron kettle and dried them in the sun and stored them in a separate barrel. When Martha Huxley came by some weeks later to borrow a needle, she asked Isobel what on earth she had done with all those bones. And Isobel showed her the barrel, full now of white, clean, sun-dried bones stacked like kindling. "I'm keeping them," Isobel said simply in her soft Highland voice. "For what?" Martha asked. "For when I need them." Martha reported this exchange to her husband Cyrus Huxley that evening, and Cyrus reported it to the other men at the sawmill the next morning. And by the end of the week, it was the running joke of Rowan Creek that the Scottish widow was storing bones in her shed for some unimaginable future use. The joke developed variations over the months that followed. It turned out that Isobel was storing a great many things in that shed. She was storing wood ashes, which every household in the settlement produced in abundance and threw out by the bushel. She was storing the tallow skimmings that formed on the top of boiled meat, which the other women fed to the dogs or scraped into the slop bucket. She was storing broken leather straps and worn-out harness scraps that the men cut off and discarded when they fitted new tack. She was storing short wool, the kind too brittle and tangled to spin into yarn, which the sheep raisers bagged up and burned every spring. She was storing urine in stoppered crocks, which was the part that truly offended the women of Rowan Creek when they learned of it, because no respectable person stored such a thing indoors or out. She was storing eggshells, crushed and dried. She was storing the feathers from every chicken anyone slaughtered. She was storing old iron nails bent beyond use, broken knife blades, cracked crockery, and the charred butt ends of candles that burned too far down for polite service. "She's collecting rubbish," said Silas Weatherby, who was the closest thing Rowan Creek had to a justice of the peace, and who took it as his personal duty to explain the world to his neighbors. "Plain, common rubbish. I've seen squirrels with better judgment about what to stash away for winter." "It's not natural," said his wife Prudence Weatherby, who was a great authority on what was and was not natural. "A widow her age, going around the footpaths with those pails every day, picking up what civilized people have thrown out. It suggests something in the mind, if you take my meaning." "She might be poor," offered Nell Bowman, who was the youngest of the married women in the settlement and who had not yet hardened into the harsher judgments that came with the later years. "Maybe back where she came from, she had no choice but to save every little thing." "Then she should be glad she's in America now," said Prudence, "where an honest woman doesn't have to demean herself hauling slop buckets." Isobel heard enough of these exchanges over the years to understand exactly what her neighbors thought of her. She heard Cyrus Huxley's 7-year-old boy call her the Bone Woman at the creek one spring afternoon, and she heard his mother laugh and not correct him. She heard a group of men at the sawmill refer to her rubbish shed with the same tone they would use for a leper's hut. She heard the minister's wife, Mrs. Tavish, suggest quietly at a quilting bee that somebody ought to speak to the poor widow about the impression she was making, as though the impression were a stain on the whole settlement. Isobel listened to all of it with the same grave, steady expression, and she went on collecting. Her reasons were not a mystery to her. She remembered Inverness in the hungry winter of 1842, when the potato had first begun to fail across the Highlands, and she remembered her mother walking her down to the tanner's yard at the edge of town to ask whether there were any scraps of hide or trimmings of leather that might be had. The tanner had given them a basket of scraps that he would otherwise have thrown in the river, and Isobel's mother had carried those scraps home and boiled them into a thick, glutinous jelly that fed the family for 3 weeks when there was nothing else. That experience had planted something in Isobel Crawford that never afterward left her. She had learned that the difference between surviving and not surviving was very often the difference between seeing value in what others called refuse, and she had learned that the way to see that value was to collect the refuse before the moment of crisis came, not after. She also knew the chemistry. This was the part her neighbors could not have guessed, because her neighbors did not know that the candlemaker's daughter had grown up knee-deep in the practical science of rendering and saponification and dye-fixing and bone ash pottery. She knew that wood ashes, properly leached with water, yielded a strong alkaline solution that the old books called potash, but that any soap maker called lye. She knew that lye combined with animal fat, stirred over a low fire, produced soap, and that the soap a family used in a year might require 15 or 20 pounds of tallow, and a barrel of leached ashes. She knew that animal bones, burned white and ground into meal, made a fertilizer so potent that a single handful worked into a planting hole would carry a tomato plant through an entire season of drought. She knew that tallow, rendered clean and mixed in the right proportions with beeswax and a little pine pitch, made a waterproofing compound that would keep a pair of work boots dry through 6 months of mud. She knew that old leather, soaked and pounded and recut, yielded straps and washers and hinge leathers that could be substituted for parts the harness maker had not thought to stockpile. She knew that short wool, carded and layered, made felt of a density that turned water like a duck's back. She knew that stale urine, aged properly in stoppered crocks, produced ammonia compounds that set dyes into cloth and cleaned grease off raw fleece better than any store-bought preparation. She knew all of this, and she knew that the materials to do all of it were being thrown away every day at Rowan Creek Settlement by people who could not see what they had in their hands. Isobel did not try to explain this to her neighbors. She had tried once, in her first year, when Martha Huxley had asked her a direct question about the ashes. She had begun to describe the leaching process, the construction of the ash hopper, the strength test with an egg, the rendering of tallow without scorching. She had seen Martha's eyes go distant within 2 minutes, and she had seen a wall come up between them that was made of the same material as the walls that go up between women of different classes everywhere. After that, Isobel understood that she was not going to change anyone's mind with a lecture on frontier chemistry. She would simply have to keep collecting, and she would have to trust that the day would come when her neighbors would look at her rubbish shed with different eyes. She organized the shed with the careful precision of a Scottish kirkwife laying out her kitchen. Against the north wall, she built a long wooden rack with 9 tiers of shelves, each shelf dedicated to a specific class of material. The top shelf held eggshells in cloth bags. The second held crushed charcoal from burned-out fires, separate from the fine ash because it had different uses. The third held dried moss and sphagnum gathered from the creek bottom, useful for wound dressings and for packing. The fourth held feathers by species, goose and duck, and chicken kept in different bags because their qualities differed. The fifth, through 7th, held wool of different grades, long staple for spinning, short staple for felting, matted wool for stuffing. The 8th held bones sorted by size, from the large leg bones of cattle, down to the fine hollow bones of poultry. The 9th held the small miscellany of broken tools and bent metal that she had collected from the burn piles behind the sawmill and the smithy. Along the east wall she set her barrels, 6 of them ranked in a row, 3 for ashes, hardwood ash, separate from softwood, separate from fruitwood, because the strengths differed, and 3 for rendered fats by source. Along the south wall she built her leather rack, with pieces hung by size and type, and her urine crocks, which she kept in a separate walled-off niche vented to the outside so that no odor ever reached the main shed. Along the west wall she set her mortar and her small hand mill, and a little iron stove that she used for careful heating work, and a workbench where she could render, grind, mix, and pack whatever her projects required. The whole shed smelled, faintly but not unpleasantly, of wood smoke and tallow, and the particular clean dryness of well-kept stored materials. A person who did not know its contents might have guessed it was the workshop of a peculiar but orderly craftsman. A person who did know might have recognized it as a chemistry laboratory of the old kind, built from fieldstone and oak and the patience of a woman who had been told her whole life that she did not matter, and who had decided long ago that she would matter in her own way, on her own terms, in her own time. By the autumn of 1848, 2.5 years after her arrival, Isobel had accumulated a working inventory that would have impressed a frontier apothecary. She had 42 pounds of rendered tallow in sealed crocks. She had 6 barrels of leached hardwood ash ready for the ash hopper. She had 280 pounds of bones, sorted and stacked. She had 16 pounds of short wool, 11 pounds of mixed feathers, 4 gallons of aged urine in the vented niche, 160 assorted leather pieces on the rack, 8 pounds of broken iron, 30 pounds of dried moss, and smaller quantities of charcoal, eggshell, beeswax salvaged from an abandoned hive, pine pitch collected from weeping trees, and the various dye-stuff lichens that she gathered from the old oaks on her back acres. She had also, by this time, saved enough silver from the sale of her garden produce and her small poultry business to pay a blacksmith in Freeport to make her a proper grinding mill and a set of iron boiling pans. She had a working chemistry shed, and she had the silver to expand it further, and she had the patience to wait for the day when somebody at Rowan Creek would realize that the Bone Woman was worth listening to. The mockery did not stop. If anything, the mockery deepened as her collection grew, because her neighbors began to see the shed as a kind of permanent proof of Isobel's eccentricity, a standing accusation against their own wastefulness that they preferred to rebut with laughter rather than examination. Silas Weatherby remarked at a town meeting in 1849 that the widow's shed would soon be larger than her cabin, and that a person might wonder whether she intended to live among her bones one day. The remark drew a good laugh from the assembled men, and it passed into the settlement's repertoire of standing jokes. Young Tom Huxley, Cyrus's middle son, grew up believing that the Scottish widow was some kind of spirit creature whose presence at the edge of the settlement kept the bad luck contained, and he threw rocks at her shed once on a dare from the Prescott boys, until his mother caught him at it and whipped him with a switch hard enough to lay welts on his legs for a week. Martha Huxley had not become Isobel's friend exactly, but she had reached a kind of accommodation with her, and she would not tolerate her son throwing stones at a widow's shed, even a shed full of bones. Isobel, for her part, made her own accommodations. She baked bread from her own oats, and she traded loaves at the Crossroads store for the things she could not make for herself. She tended a good garden, and she put up preserves, and she kept 6 hens and a small flock of geese. She walked the 2 miles to the stone meeting house every Sunday, and she sat in a back pew, and she listened to the minister's sermons with the grave, steady attention that she gave to most things. She did not gossip, and she did not complain, and she did not explain. She simply lived her life, and she kept her shed, and she added to her inventory season by season, and she waited. She had learned patience during the Highland hunger years, and she had learned that the world eventually presents, to the patient person, the exact circumstance in which a patiently accumulated resource becomes suddenly, shatteringly relevant. The circumstance, when it came, arrived in a sequence of failures so compound and so specific that nobody at Rowan Creek could quite believe it when the full picture came into focus. The first failure was the rain. The autumn of 1852 brought a succession of heavy storms across western Pennsylvania that soaked the ground beyond its capacity to hold water. And on the 22nd of October, a 14-hour downpour turned the small creeks of the region into rivers, and the rivers into something that stripped the bark from trees 20 feet above the normal water line. The wagon road through Douglas Gap, which was the only reliable route between Rowan Creek and the supply town of Freeport, washed out in 3 separate places. 2 bridges were carried away entirely. A section of the road itself was scoured down to the bedrock, leaving a 20-foot drop where the grade had once been. The second failure was the mill race at the Allegheny ferry crossing. The ferry had been the alternate route into Freeport when the Gap Road was impassable, and it had carried a fair volume of trade through the previous summer. But the flood scoured out the mill race that powered the ferry's winch mechanism, and the landing itself was so badly undercut by the rushing water that the ferry captain declared it unsafe for any load heavier than a man on horseback. The bigger wagon loads, the supplies, the barrels and crates and rolls of imported goods would have to wait until the landing could be rebuilt in the spring. The third failure was the fire. On the 11th of November, shortly after the Gap Road had been declared impassable until spring, the warehouse of Amos Reedy in Freeport caught fire in the middle of the night. Reedy was the principal supply merchant for the Rowan Creek region, and his warehouse held the season's imported stock: bolts of finished cloth, barrels of processed soap from Philadelphia, bags of commercial fertilizer, cases of bottled medicines, tools from the Pittsburgh ironworks, boots and leather goods from the Lancaster tanneries, and the great tin tubs of waterproofing compound that the farmers used to dress their boots and harness against winter wet. The fire burned through the warehouse and the adjacent store, and by morning there was nothing left but a scorched foundation and a column of smoke that could be seen for 10 miles. Reedy was ruined. He could order new stock from Philadelphia, but Philadelphia was now on the wrong side of a flooded pass, and a washed-out ferry, and the replacement goods would not reach Freeport until the spring freight trains could come up the Allegheny. The fourth failure was the calendar. Winter was already beginning. The first snow fell on the 19th of November, and the second snow, heavier, came on the 24th. By the first week of December, the settlement at Rowan Creek understood that it was cut off. There would be no resupply, no imported goods, no replacement tools or fertilizers or soaps or boot dressings or leather straps, or any of the thousand small manufactured items that a frontier community had come to depend on from the outside world. The settlement had what it had and what it could make, and nothing more, and it would have to last until April or May, whenever the waters went down and the freight trains could resume. The panic, when it came, did not come all at once. It came in small waves, each one triggered by a specific domestic failure that illuminated a specific shortage. Martha Huxley was the first to feel it. In the second week of December, she ran out of laundry soap, and when she walked to the Crossroads store to buy more, she discovered that Mr. Prescott, who kept the store, had sold the last of his soap 3 days before. He had placed an order with Freeport in October like every other year, and the order had burned in the Reedy warehouse fire. Martha went home and used her last bar of bathing soap on the laundry, and 3 days after that she was down to nothing. She stood in her kitchen with a pile of soiled children's clothes and a big pot of hot water and no way to wash them, and she cried for 20 minutes before she pulled herself together and boiled the clothes in plain water and hung them out, hoping that the sun and the wind would do what soap could not. The second failure was fertilizer. The farmers of Rowan Creek had been told by the agricultural extension man the previous summer that the commercial bone meal arriving from Philadelphia was the best thing any of them could work into their fields for the spring planting, and several families had placed substantial orders for delivery in February. Those orders were now ash in Reedy's warehouse, and the farmers understood by mid-December that they would have to plant in April with nothing but last year's manure, which was not enough, and which everyone knew was not enough because the thin Pennsylvania soil of Rowan Creek had been cropped hard for 6 years and needed phosphorus in quantities that no amount of cow manure could supply. The third failure was waterproofing. This one hit the men the hardest because the men wore boots and walked the woods in all weathers, and boots that were not properly dressed before hard winter use would split at the seams and rot from the sole up within weeks. The Reedy warehouse had held the whole winter's stock of boot dressing for the region. Cyrus Huxley went out on a trap check on the 8th of December and came home with his boots so wet inside that he had to pull off his socks and find them frozen to the leather. He knew, and every man in the settlement knew, that cold, wet feet for a winter meant frostbite at best and gangrene at worst, and gangrene meant a man losing toes or a foot or his life. The fourth failure was tools. The smithy at Rowan Creek was run by a good man named Obadiah Fenn, who had come out from eastern Pennsylvania with a decent stock of iron and a working bellows, and the skill to make most of what the settlement needed. But the finer items, the saw blades and plane irons and drill bits, and the small delicate parts that required specialized forging, came from the Pittsburgh Iron Works by way of Reedy's warehouse. Those were gone too, and the settlement's stock of replacement blades and irons had been running low through the autumn. By the middle of December, Fenn was turning away men who needed tool repairs because he had no suitable stock for the finer work, and the men were growing restless because a farmer without a working plane and a sharp saw was a farmer who could not build, repair, or maintain the structures that kept his family alive. The fifth failure, which came last and hit hardest because it touched everyone, was the leather. The Lancaster tanneries had been the principal source of finished leather for the Rowan Creek region, and their product had come through Reedy's warehouse. Without resupply, the settlement was down to what each family had on hand, which was not much, because everyone had expected the winter stock to arrive in November, when harness straps began to break, as harness straps always do under winter strain. There was no replacement leather to cut new ones from. When boot soles split, there was nothing to resole with. When a plow trace snapped during the late December clearing work on the Bowman place, Nell Bowman's husband Jasper stood in his barn for an hour staring at the broken strap, as though the strap itself had personally betrayed him. By the third week of December, Rowan Creek understood that it had a crisis. The families gathered at the stone meeting house on the evening of the 21st, a bitter night with a hard wind out of the northwest and 6 inches of new snow on the ground, and they sat on the wooden benches, and they tried to assess their situation. Silas Weatherby, who had appointed himself spokesman for the settlement's practical affairs, opened the meeting by listing the shortages. The list took him 20 minutes to get through, because every time he named a category, somebody else thought of a subcategory, and the whole assembly grew more and more quiet as the dimensions of the problem came into focus. "We cannot get supplies until April," Silas said when he had finished the inventory. "We must therefore make do with what we have and what we can produce for ourselves. The question before us is whether we can produce for ourselves what we need." The answer, as the discussion made clear over the next hour, was that they could not. Soap was theoretically possible to make from fat and ashes, but none of the women present had ever made it themselves, because commercial soap had been available cheap and plentiful at Prescott's store for as long as any of them had been keeping house. Fertilizer was theoretically possible to make from bones, but nobody in the settlement had either the bones or the knowledge of how to burn and grind them. Waterproofing was theoretically possible to make from tallow and wax, but the precise ratios were a mystery, and the men who had grown up in eastern cities had never dressed a boot by any means other than going to the store and buying a tin of dressing. Leather could be cut from hides, but the hides had to be tanned, and tanning was a long and noxious process that took months to complete with materials that none of them had ready. Prudence Weatherby, who rarely spoke at town meetings, raised her hand at this point in the discussion and said, "The Scottish widow." A silence came over the meeting house. Silas looked at his wife as though she had suggested consulting a ghost. "She has bones," Prudence said. "She has ashes. She has been gathering those things for 6 years. She has tallow and leather scraps and wool and 100 other things. I do not know what she intends to do with them, but she has them, and we have nothing." "Prudence," Silas began, in the tone of a man who was about to explain that his wife had misunderstood the situation. "I saw her shed the last time I brought her the rendering fat that I did not want," Prudence said, cutting him off in a way she had never done in 18 years of marriage. "She keeps it like a chemist. Shelves and barrels and labels. Whatever else she may be, she's been preparing for something, and what she has been preparing for looks very like what we are facing now." Martha Huxley, who had been listening, spoke up next. "I have taken her bones for years, every pig we've killed since 1846. I did not know what she meant to do with them, but she always took them, and she always carried them home, and she always came back the next autumn for more." A murmur went through the meeting house. Men who had mocked Isobel Crawford's rubbish shed for 6 years were finding suddenly that they did not want to have been the ones mocking the rubbish shed, because the rubbish shed was beginning to sound very much like the only place in the settlement where the materials to solve their crisis might already be stockpiled. "Somebody must go and ask her," said Nell Bowman, who had always had a softer opinion of Isobel than most. "Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." It was Martha Huxley who went. She wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak, and she walked the half-mile through the snow to Isobel's cabin, and she knocked on the door, and when Isobel opened it, Martha stood on the threshold and said without preamble, "We need your help. The settlement. We are running out of everything, and we remember that you have things. Please." Isobel looked at her for a long moment in the light of the tallow candle she held. Martha could see in her face no trace of triumph, no trace of satisfaction at the vindication that had finally come. Only a kind of grave, steady attention that Martha recognized because she had seen it on Isobel's face for 6 years and had never quite understood what it was. It was the attention of a woman who had been waiting. "Come in," Isobel said. "Come in out of the cold. We shall talk." The conversation that followed, at Isobel's small kitchen table over mugs of hot tea that she had saved from her Glasgow supply, became the founding document of what the later historians of the Rowan Creek region would call the Winter of the Widow. Isobel asked Martha to describe the shortages in detail, and she made notes on a piece of brown paper with a quill pen she had trimmed to a fine point. She asked about the number of households, the number of children, the approximate amounts of soap and fertilizer and leather and dressing that the settlement would need to get through to April. She asked about the skills of the women, the capacity of the smithy, the state of the available firewood. She asked, in short, the questions of a woman who was assembling a production plan, and Martha answered as best she could, and the plan that emerged from the conversation was audacious in its scope and reasonable in its structure. Isobel had, she explained, enough raw materials in her shed to produce the following approximate quantities: about 200 pounds of laundry soap, which at 2 bars per family per month for the 16 households of Rowan Creek would be more than enough to carry them through the winter with a surplus for spring cleaning. About 300 pounds of bone meal fertilizer, which broadcast at the rate the old Scottish farmers had used in the Highlands, would enrich 40 acres of spring-planted fields. About 60 pounds of boot and harness dressing, which would treat every pair of boots in the settlement twice over and leave enough for the worst of the leather repair work. About 40 pounds of serviceable reclaimed leather in various grades, which could be cut to make harness straps, boot patches, hinge leathers, and the smaller pieces needed for tool handles and bellows repairs. About 80 pounds of felted wool for winter liners, patches, and packing, and smaller quantities of specialty items, bone ash glue, pine pitch caulking, tallow and beeswax candle stock, and the dye and mordant compounds that the women would need to turn homespun into clothing when the store-bought calico ran out. "You have all of this already?" Martha said when Isobel had finished. "I have the materials," Isobel said. "I have not yet made all of the products. The soap must be boiled. The bones must be burned and ground. The dressing must be compounded. All of this requires labor and time and fuel, and I cannot do it alone. But if you will help me, and if the women of the settlement will help me, we shall have what we need by the middle of February." "And in return?" Martha said. Isobel looked at her across the table for another long moment. Martha understood, looking at her, that she had just asked a question that had a great many possible answers, and that Isobel was choosing among them. "In return," Isobel said at last, "you will help me teach the women, all of them, everything I know, because I will not always be here, and this knowledge must not die with me. That is the payment I ask, nothing else." Martha put down her tea and covered her face with her hands, and she cried because for 6 years she had walked past Isobel Crawford's rubbish shed, and she had laughed, and the woman in that shed had been silently preparing to save her children's lives. When she had composed herself, she took Isobel's hand across the table and she said, "Whatever you ask, whatever you need, I will bring every woman in the settlement." Work began on the 23rd of December, and it went on through the darkest weeks of the winter in a continuous, organized campaign that transformed Isobel Crawford's stone outbuilding from a private chemistry shed into the manufacturing heart of Rowan Creek settlement. The women came first at Martha's summons, 6 of them on the first day, and 9 by the end of the week. They came in pairs and threes, walking through the snow with aprons over their coats, and their hair tied back under kerchiefs, and Isobel received them at the shed door with a grave courtesy that put them all instantly at ease. She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She put them to work. The first project was soap. Isobel had planned the sequence carefully because soap was the shortage that affected every household most immediately, and soap was also the production that required the most preparatory work. She and Martha Huxley set up the ash hopper in the shed's southeast corner, a barrel with a false bottom of clean sticks, and a layer of straw and a wooden drain that led to a catch trough. They filled the hopper with the hardwood ash from Isobel's first 2 barrels, and they began the slow work of pouring rainwater over the ashes and collecting the leached lye that dripped out below. The lye came out first pale and weak, and Isobel tested it by floating a fresh hen's egg in a small cup of the liquid. The egg sank to the bottom. "Weak," she said. "We run it through again." They ran the same lye through the hopper a second time, and then a third, and by the 4th pass, the egg rode high enough in the solution to show a patch of shell the size of a silver coin above the surface, and Isobel declared the lye ready. The women gathered around to see the test, and Isobel explained the principle to them in her careful, unhurried way. The egg rode high when the lye was strong enough to make good soap. If the egg rode too high, the lye was too strong, and would burn the fat rather than saponify it. If the egg sank, The lye was too weak and would never combine. The test was the ancient test that Scottish soap makers had used for centuries, and it worked in western Pennsylvania exactly as it had worked in Inverness. The rendering of the tallow came next. Isobel had 42 pounds of saved fat in her crocks, and she added to this the fresh fat that the Huxleys and the Bowmans had brought from their winter butchering, and the total came to 68 pounds of animal fat ready for the process. They rendered it in Isobel's largest iron kettle over a slow fire in the yard, skimming off the impurities and the bits of meat that floated to the top, boiling it with water to draw out any residual blood, letting it cool and harden, and then scraping the clean white tallow off the top of the cooled water for the soap kettle. The rendering took 3 full days of continuous work, with the women taking shifts at the kettle and Isobel moving among them, adjusting the fire, testing the fat, explaining each step as she went. The soap boiling itself was the climactic operation, and it drew a crowd. Isobel had sent word back to the settlement through Martha that the first batch of soap would be made on the 28th of December, and by noon that day, nearly every woman in Rowan Creek was standing in Isobel's yard, watching the great iron kettle over a crackling hickory fire. Isobel added the strong lye to the melted tallow in careful, measured amounts, stirring the mixture with a long wooden paddle that her father had cut for her in Scotland. The mixture frothed and darkened and began to thicken, and the women watched the chemistry unfold with the same fascination that their grandmothers had brought to the same process on 1,000 Highland homesteads over 1,000 winters. Isobel stirred for 3 hours without stopping, and when the mixture had reached the stage that the old books called the trace, when a drop of it held on the paddle would leave a visible line on the surface of the batch, she stopped stirring and declared the reaction complete. They would let it cool through the night, she said, and in the morning they would have soft soap in the kettle, and they would begin the hardening with salt from Isobel's reserve. The first hard soap was cut on the 30th of December. Isobel produced it from the cooled kettle in a great soft mass, and she salted it down with coarse salt from a crock she had been saving for years, and the salt drew the water out of the mass and left a dense, firm paste that she cut into bars with a length of wire stretched between 2 wooden handles. The bars were the color of old ivory, and they smelled faintly of wood smoke and tallow, and they were the first bars of soap produced inside the Rowan Creek settlement in its 12-year history. Martha Huxley took the first bar home to her husband Cyrus, and Cyrus sat in his kitchen and looked at the bar for a long time, and then he asked his wife to take him to meet the widow. "You've known her for 6 years," Martha said. "I've known of her," Cyrus said. "I want to know her." Cyrus Huxley came to the shed that afternoon, and he stood at the door with his hat in his hand. And when Isobel opened the door, he said, "Mrs. Crawford, I have been a fool. I have been a fool for 6 years, and I have come to say so, and to ask what help I may offer." Isobel looked at him with the same grave attention she had given to Martha a week earlier. Then she said, "You may help with the bones, Mr. Huxley. I need a man who can build a burning pit, and a man who can split hardwood, and a man who is not afraid of the smell of calcined bone. Can you be such a man?" "I can," Cyrus said. "And come inside, and we shall talk." The bone burning began on the 4th of January, and it went on for 3 weeks. Cyrus Huxley dug a long narrow pit behind the shed and lined it with fieldstone, and he built a hardwood fire in the bottom of it. And when the fire had burned down to a deep bed of coals, he laid Isobel's sorted bones on iron racks above the coals. The bones burned slowly, turning first black and then gray, and finally to a chalky white as the organic matter cooked off and left only the mineral calcium phosphate behind. When a batch was finished, Cyrus pulled out the racks with long iron tongs, and the white bones were crushed and then ground in Isobel's hand mill to a fine meal the color of bleached linen. The meal went into cotton sacks, and the sacks went into a dry corner of the shed, and by the end of January, there were 340 pounds of bone meal fertilizer waiting for the spring planting. Cyrus was transformed by the work. A man who had spent 6 years laughing at the widow's bone collection found himself, in his 50th year, learning chemistry from a Scottish woman 10 years his junior, and the learning did something to him that went deeper than the practical skills involved. He became, over the course of those 3 weeks, a quieter man. He stopped making jokes at the Sunday gatherings. He began to listen more than he spoke. His wife Martha noticed the change and did not comment on it, because she understood that her husband was working through a reckoning that did not require her help. And she understood also that a man who had found out at 50 that he had been wrong about something important for 6 years was a man who needed time. The waterproofing came next, and it was Jasper Bowman's education, because Jasper was the settlement's harness and leather man by temperament, and Isobel put him in charge of the dressing production. She taught him the formula that her father had taught her: 7 parts rendered tallow, 2 parts beeswax, 1 part pine pitch, compounded over a gentle heat with a small addition of neatsfoot oil from rendered cow's feet. She showed him how to melt the ingredients in a small iron pan without scorching them, how to stir them until they blended into a smooth amber compound, how to pour the compound into shallow tins, where it would harden into the familiar tan cakes of boot dressing. Jasper made 64 pounds of dressing over the course of 2 weeks, and the tins went out to every household in Rowan Creek, and within a month every pair of boots in the settlement had been treated twice, and the men could walk the woods again without fearing for their feet. The leather reclamation was Prudence Weatherby's project, which surprised everyone, including Prudence. She had come to the shed on the 4th day of the soap making, not out of any sudden conversion, but because she could not bear to stay home while every other woman in the settlement was doing important work. She had stood at the door of the shed with her mouth set in its familiar hard line, and she had said to Isobel, "I suppose you'll have me carry ashes like a servant." Isobel had looked at her and looked past her and said, "No, I shall have you do the leather work. Come inside." Prudence Weatherby had grown up in a Lancaster County household, where the father had been a harness maker, and she had watched her father cut and stitch leather from the time she could sit up on a stool. She had not worked leather in 30 years, but she sat down at Isobel's leather rack with a pile of collected scraps and a knife and a set of copper rivets that Obadiah Fenn had sent over from the smithy, and within an hour her hands had remembered what her mind had forgotten, and she was cutting and trimming and stitching with a precision that made the other women stop and watch. By the end of January, Prudence had produced more than 100 serviceable leather items from the scrap collection: 34 harness straps, 48 boot patches, 20 hinged leathers for doors and cabinets, and a great many smaller pieces for tool handles, belt repairs, and bellows patches. Her husband Silas came by the shed one afternoon to bring her a hot meal, and he saw her at the bench with a piece of leather in her hands, and a look on her face that he had not seen in 30 years of marriage. And he went home, and he did not say anything to anyone, but he sat in his kitchen for an hour in the deep kind of silence that comes upon a man when he realizes he has underestimated his wife for most of a lifetime. Obadiah Fenn came to the shed in the 2nd week of January, at the height of the bone burning, and he brought with him the broken tools that the settlement had been accumulating through the autumn. Isobel walked him through her small miscellany shelf, the shelf of bent iron and broken blades and salvaged hardware that her neighbors had laughed at for years. Fenn was not a man who laughed easily, and he did not laugh now. He picked through the collection with the practiced eye of a blacksmith, and he found among the scraps enough usable iron to restock his forge for 2 months of repair work. He found 3 broken plane irons whose steel, reheated and reforged, would make a dozen small blades. He found a cracked anvil chisel that could be cut down and retempered as a punch. He found a box of bent nails that could be straightened and reused. He found, in short, the raw material inventory of a working smithy, and he carried it all back to his shop on a sled. And he spent the next month working through it and producing the tools that the settlement needed for the rest of the winter. The felting of the wool was done by Nell Bowman and a young woman named Harriet Prescott, the storekeeper's daughter. Isobel had 16 pounds of short wool in her racks, and she added to this the wool that the sheep-raising families had been planning to burn in the spring. She showed the younger women how to card the fibers in 2 directions, how to layer them in crisscrossed mats, how to soak them in hot soapy water, and agitate them by hand until the fibers locked together into a dense felt. The felt came off the bench in sheets 3 feet long and half an inch thick, and those sheets were cut into boot liners and mitten liners and coat padding, and the packing material that the men needed for the gaps in their cabin walls. Nell and Harriet produced 40 pounds of felted goods in a month, and the felt went out to the settlement with the soap and the dressing and the reclaimed leather. By the middle of February, the crisis had passed. Rowan Creek had soap, fertilizer, waterproofing, leather, tools, felt, and the hundred smaller necessaries that Isobel's shed had yielded up to the organized labor of the settlement's women and men. The production work continued through February and into March, because the shed contained more materials than the settlement had yet processed, and Isobel intended to finish the inventory before spring broke. But the panic was gone. Every household had what it needed. The spring planting would go in with adequate fertilizer. The boots and harness would hold through the wet months of March. The tools in the fields and the smithy were working tools once again. What changed in Rowan Creek during those months went deeper than the inventory. The women who had come to Isobel's shed had learned chemistry, and the chemistry had changed them. Martha Huxley, who had not understood the ash leaching process when Isobel had tried to explain it in 1846, now understood it perfectly well, and she understood also why her mother-in-law, the old woman who had come from Ulster, had always saved the hardwood ashes in a separate crock. Prudence Weatherby, who had been a harder and unhappier woman than she had admitted to herself for many years, had found in the leather work a reconnection to the girl she had been in her father's shop, and something in her softened that had been hardening for decades. Nell Bowman, who had always been one of the kinder members of the settlement, had gained in the felting work a skill that she would use for the rest of her life, and she taught that skill in turn to her own daughters and to the younger women who came to Rowan Creek in the years after. The men changed too. Cyrus Huxley became Isobel's steady friend and her most frequent defender in the settlement's political life. When a new family came in from the east in 1854 and somebody at the Crossroads store made a remark about the widow's shed, Cyrus turned on the speaker with a slow, grave anger that the speaker did not forget, and the remark was never repeated. Silas Weatherby, who had lectured the settlement for years on its practical affairs, became markedly quieter at town meetings, and when he spoke with a humility that his neighbors had never heard from him before. Jasper Bowman became the settlement's harness maker in effect, if not in title, and the dressing he compounded from Isobel's formula became locally famous, so that men came from 20 miles away to buy it. Isobel herself did not change, or rather she changed in a way that only she could see. The grave, steady attention that she had worn for 6 years gave way, slowly, to a quieter expression, something closer to peace. She had not been waiting for vindication exactly. She had been waiting for the moment when her knowledge would be allowed to do the work it had been accumulated to do. And that moment had come and gone, and she had watched her materials and her methods flow out into the settlement to save her neighbors' children from a hard winter that could have killed some of them. She did not feel triumph over this. She felt rather the deep relief of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down in the right place. When the spring came and the pass opened and the freight wagons began rolling again through Douglas Gap, Rowan Creek found itself changed. The women of the settlement, meeting at Isobel's shed through the rest of that year, developed a system of collective material stewardship that spread through the surrounding countryside within 5 years. Every household kept an ash crock, a bone barrel, a fat crock, a wool bag, and a leather scrap box. Every household contributed to the settlement's common reserve, which was housed in an expanded outbuilding that the men of Rowan Creek built next to Isobel's shed in the summer of 1853. The reserve was drawn on annually for the settlement's soap making, its fertilizer production, its dressing compounding, and its leather reclamation, and the work was done in common by the women and men who had learned it at Isobel's side during the winter of the widow. The methods spread. A traveling Methodist minister who passed through Rowan Creek in 1855 wrote an account of the settlement's material practices in a letter to a newspaper in Pittsburgh, and the letter was reprinted in several journals of agricultural improvement. A woman from a settlement 40 miles to the north came down to Rowan Creek in 1856 to learn the ash and tallow soap method from the Rowan Creek women, and she took the method home and taught it to the women of her own settlement. By 1860, the Scottish method, as it came to be called in the region, was the standard practice across western Pennsylvania's rural communities, and it remained so until the commercial soap industry and the cheap fertilizer of the post-war years made it economically irrelevant in the 1880s. Isobel Crawford lived to see most of this. She died in the autumn of 1874 at the age of 62 of a winter pneumonia that she did not have the strength to fight off. She was buried in the stone churchyard at Rowan Creek, with the whole settlement present at the graveside, and the stone was carved with her name and her dates, and the 3 Gaelic words that she had asked Martha Huxley to have inscribed on it. The words meant nothing works alone, and they were the closest thing to a summary of her philosophy that she had ever spoken aloud. Everything in her shed had been connected to everything else. The ashes and the bones and the tallow, momo, and the leather had all been parts of a single web of practical chemistry, and that web had held the settlement together when the larger webs of supply and commerce had failed. She had been mocked for understanding this for 6 years. She had been honored for understanding it for 22. The stone outbuilding stood behind the Crawford cabin for another 80 years. The cabin was rebuilt twice in that time, and the land passed through 3 owners after the last of Isobel's grandnieces sold it in 1923. But the shed was left standing because the people of Rowan Creek would not allow it to be torn down. It was used at various times as a tool shed, a smokehouse, and a storage building for seed corn. In 1957, the Rowan Creek Historical Society acquired the property and restored the shed to something close to its 1852 condition, with wooden barrels along the east wall and a leather rack on the south, and the 9-tiered shelf system on the north, all stocked with the materials that Isobel had once stored there. A small plaque at the door explained what the building had been, and what had happened inside it during the winter of 1852, and school children from the county were brought to see it on educational visits through the 1960s and 1970s. The plaque has been refaced 3 times since. The shed still stands. What Isobel Crawford understood, and what the settlement of Rowan Creek learned from her through one hard winter, was a truth that every pre-modern society had known, and that industrial societies were in the process of forgetting even as she lived. The truth was that the materials of daily life are never merely waste. They are resources awaiting the right application. Wood ash is not rubbish. It is potassium hydroxide precursor, the key to saponification, the basis of soap for half of human history. Bone is not rubbish. It is calcium phosphate, the single most important soil amendment for phosphorus-depleted fields. Tallow is not rubbish. It is the fat substrate for soap, candles, waterproofing, and a dozen medicinal preparations. Leather scrap is not rubbish. It is reworkable material for straps, patches, and repair work of every kind. Short wool is not rubbish. It is the raw material for felt, which has kept people warm and dry since the Bronze Age. Even urine, which the women of Rowan Creek could not bear to think about, is not rubbish. It is a source of ammonia compounds that were used for cleaning, dye setting, and tanning across every European culture for 2,000 years. The industrial economy that was rising around Isobel during her lifetime was teaching people to throw these materials away, because the industrial economy could manufacture substitutes more cheaply than most individuals could reclaim the originals. That was a genuine benefit, in good times. But the lesson of the Winter of the Widow was that good times are not the only times, and that a community which has forgotten how to value its own material streams is a community that will stand helpless when the outside supply fails. Isobel Crawford had not forgotten. She had brought the memory with her from a starving country, and she had held it through 6 years of mockery in a prosperous country, and when the prosperous country's prosperity failed for one hard season, her memory had been the only thing that stood between her neighbors in a very bad winter. The deeper lesson was about patience, and about the particular patience of the person who is right in a way that the world has not yet acknowledged. Isobel had known she was right for 6 years, and she had not argued, and she had not protested, and she had not tried to force her neighbors to understand. She had simply continued the work on the understanding that the work was its own argument, and that the work would speak for itself when the moment came. That patience is rare in any generation, and it is especially rare in a generation that values self-expression above endurance. But the patience is what allowed Isobel's stockpile to exist when the settlement needed it. if she had quarreled with her neighbors in 1847, if she had argued with Silas Weatherby at the town meetings, if she had insisted on justifying herself, she would have exhausted her energy on the fights, and she would not have had the reserves to build the shed into what it became. The patience was the thing that made the shed possible, and the shed was the thing that saved the settlement. The still deeper lesson, the one that the women of Rowan Creek understood after living through it, but that they rarely articulated in words, was about the nature of community itself. A community is not a collection of self-sufficient households connected by a commercial supply chain. A community is a web of interdependent skills and resources that reveal their true shape when the commercial supply chain fails. In the ordinary times, a settlement can look like 16 independent families who happen to live near one another. In the crisis times, a settlement reveals itself as what its bow has been all along, a single organism whose survival depends on whether any one of its members has been paying attention to something that all the others ignored. Isobel Crawford had been paying attention for 6 years. She had been, in a sense, the settlement's memory of its own vulnerability, carried in the form of stored material and accumulated skill. The settlement had not known it had that memory until it needed it. But it had it, because she had kept it, and the keeping had cost her 6 years of mockery and the slow, grinding social exclusion that a frontier community imposes on its eccentrics. She had paid that cost without complaint, because she had been paying such costs since her Highland girlhood, and she had understood that the costs were the price of the work. The work was the thing that mattered. The work was what remained after the mockery and the exclusion had been forgotten. The work was the soap in Martha Huxley's laundry tub, and the bone meal on Cyrus Huxley's spring-planted fields, and the dressing on Jasper Bowman's boots, and the felt in the children's mittens, and the reclaimed leather in Obadiah Fenn's tool handles. The work was the warm bodies of the Rowan Creek children in the winter of 1853, none of whom had caught the fevers that cold, wet feet and unwashed clothes would otherwise have brought down upon them. The work was the 40 acres of spring wheat that came up thick and heavy that April, because the soil had finally been given the phosphorus it had been starving for. The work was, in the final accounting, the continuation of a community that would otherwise have broken under a single hard winter, and the continuation of that community was worth every one of the 6 years of mockery that Isobel Crawford had borne without a word of protest. The lesson of her life, if it can be reduced to a sentence, is this: what a community throws away is usually what it will most need when the outside world stops supplying it. And the person who has been patiently collecting those things is usually the person the community has been mocking. If you find yourself laughing at someone's collection, it is worth asking whether you are laughing because the collection is foolish, or because the collector has seen something you have not yet learned to see. The answer is not always the second thing, but it is sometimes the second thing, and the settlements that survive their hard winters are the ones that recognize this in time. Rowan Creek recognized it in time. The settlement endured, and it passed on its recognition to the settlements around it, and the practices of the Scottish widow became the practices of a region. By the time Isobel died, her way of thinking had been normalized across western Pennsylvania to such an extent that the children growing up in those communities could no longer remember a time when people had thrown away their ashes, their bones, their tallow, or their wool. Those children grew up into a world that began to industrialize in earnest after the Civil War, and the industrial world gradually made the old practices irrelevant for most households. But the memory of the winter of the widow persisted in the oral history of the region, passed down in kitchens and around hearths. And when the hard times came again in the 1890s and the 1930s, the older women of the Rowan Creek families knew what to do, and they taught their daughters. And the daughters remembered, and the memory was not lost. It is not lost now. It is in the plaque at the restored shed, and in the county historical records, and in the letters of the traveling Methodist minister, and in a dozen other places where the story of the Scottish widow was written down by people who understood that the story was worth preserving. It is in this account. It is in the eyes of every person who has ever walked past a pile of what looks like rubbish and paused for a moment to wonder what that rubbish might be good for, and whether a person patient enough to collect it might not be the person to thank when the hard winter comes. If this story moved you, if you found yourself thinking about the quiet people in your own life who have been seeing what others do not see, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have more documented accounts of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, and we share them in the hope that the patterns they reveal might be useful to someone, somewhere, who is still collecting what the world is still throwing away. Comment below with your city and time. We love reading where these stories reach, and we are always glad to know that the memory of people like Isobel Crawford is still traveling, still useful, still worth the keeping. Thank you for listening.